The Permian Period, the seventh and last of the Paleozoic era. There will be plenty of change going on in the Permian, both in the geology and in life forms across the planet. In the Grand Canyon, we see Permian rocks from the top of the thick red sequence here, the top of the Supai, all the way up to the rim. These are all rocks of Permian age, and they represent deposition in a suite of different sedimentary environments, from river floodplain to desert sand dune to shallow marine. And in these different environments, life forms like these pelycosaurs were flourishing. A pelycosaur is a very distinctive Permian animal. It is not a dinosaur, even though it looks like one. It's a very type of mammal-like reptile. So it is more related to a mammal than it is a dinosaur. And we'll talk about that. The Permian Period, the last of the Paleozoic, spans a length of time from 299 to 252. So here's the ICS chart with the Permian. Capping the Paleozoic era, we have the Permian, which is made up of several different epochs. Some of these are more referred to in the literature, but again, we won't have to really bother with the Guadalupian or the Wordian or Rhodian. The name itself comes from a region in Russia where similar aged rocks are exposed in the Ural Mountains. The geography of the Permian, similar to that of the Pennsylvanian. It's all about Pangaea. So from pole to pole, we have a landmass stretching from the South Pole all the way more or less to the North Pole. Large areas of desert plain, coastal plain, huge swaths of terrain. We see the similar mountain belts, the Alleghanian Highlands here in the central part of Pangaea, dividing Laurasia from Gondwana. The ancestral Rockies over here, the Ural Mountains developing over towards Siberia. The ocean basins remain the same, Panthalassa being the major western ocean in this case, and the Paleotethys. Now it's become enclosed and will become smaller as those jaws start to collide, and it will squeeze this ocean basin with time. There's also the Tethys down here. Remember when Panthalassa used to be the northern ocean, when Gondwana and other cratons were down here in the south. Now it's more or less a western ocean. Well, let's look at Ron Blakey's paleoglobes for the Permian. This is about 280 during the early Permian. Here's Pangaea, Laurasia in the north, Gondwana in the south. Large areas of continent well away from any body of water. You can see desert environments cover much of Laurasia, including where Arizona is. Shallow marine shelf around much of Pangaea. There is an active margin off here to the west, and that's the subduction zone that's been there for a few periods now. So the Antler Highlands subducting into Euramerica and now Laurasia, and there's another fragment coming in here, and by the end of the Permian, that's going to make some noise. On the other side of the planet, the eastern hemisphere, you can see the jaws of Pangaea. Okay, and so this is the Paleotethys Ocean. And that's going to develop over time as tectonics move these plates around. The Tethys Ocean would be down here. Into the late Permian, this is a similar look for the planet. Pangaea is still there, Laurasia and Gondwana. One thing to notice is the Alleghanian Highlands have eroded down to some degree, but they're still in their east-west orientation. The mid-latitude deserts have grown in Laurasia and in Gondwana. We still have the shallow marine areas, we still have the subduction zone and the arc off to the west. A few more scraps floating around the Paleotethys and the Tethys itself in the eastern hemisphere. So just to play the flip book game, let's go back to the early Permian at 280 and then see the change into the late Permian about 260. So it's about 20 million years. So looking at the Alleghanian Highlands, you can see they're nice and bold when they're young, and after about 20 million years of erosion, they're probably worn down. You can see they're still intact in their east-west trend, but probably a little more mature, a little bit more eroded. The Urals are the same thing. Off to the west, we see the subduction zone here, early Permian, late Permian, not a whole lot of change, except you can see this fragment here has gotten closer and actually starts to collide with Laurasia. Early Permian, late Permian. Zooming in on Laurasia, or northern Pangaea, we see this view. Here are the Alleghanian Highlands. That would be more or less the equator running east-west along the equator. This would be Gondwana. This is Laurasia. Huge areas of continental plain, desert, floodplain. In Arizona, you can see we have sand deserts, shallow marine areas, again a variety of depositional environments much like the Pennsylvanian. This is early Permian at 290. Let's go to the middle Permian about 15 million years later. Not much has changed here. We can still see these desert regions and shallow marine areas encroaching in the western part of Laurasia. Various fingers of the sea entering into Pangaea here from either side. And then late Permian, about 260. Again, there are some incursions of the sea onto the continent. You can see this starting here. That's the early portion of Pangaea starting to rift apart. That's more or less where it's going to happen. And it's going to start up here first. So the sea starting to creep in. See a lot of activity on the west coast here as all these little fragments, including one big fragment, being lumped onto the margin of Laurasia. So things will get quite active over here on the west side during the end of the Permian. Let's back it up to early and go through the sequence. Here's early, middle, late. So see the mountain belt itself, the Alleghanian Highlands, how they change. Get this region down here in Arizona from the early Permian to late. So a little bit of change. You can see the ancestral Rockies starting to wear down. See, there they are, wearing down throughout the Permian. And then finally, the island arc scraps and other pieces being accreted onto the west coast there over the Permian. This subduction zone is going to persist for the rest of geologic history along most of the west coast of what will become North America. In terms of the geography of western Laurasia, diverse environments, from non-marine environments of rivers, streams, floodplains, sand deserts, you name it, to shallow marine environments, continental shelves, deep marine environments, islands, island arcs, continental microfragments, a whole suite of different landscapes and environments. We still have the ancestral Rockies, albeit they're much more subdued at this point. The Alleghanian Highlands as well. And in between, seaways would develop over time, and some of these seaways would have deeper parts. We'd call them basins. Giant reef complexes, much like what happened earlier in the Paleozoic in the Michigan Basin area, would develop in this area as well. And these reef complexes would form on these broad shelves. There'd be lots of evaporation being near the equator, so evaporites would form in abundance as well. Permian tectonics, well, one word, Pangaea. It's come together, and there's a lot of activity in many different areas of Pangaea. In some places there are collisional events going on, in other places there's some rifting. The supercontinent itself, sutured along the Alleghanian Highlands, you have the ancestral Rockies, we have the Ural Mountains, a number of different places where there's compressional, convergent tectonics going on. Around its boundaries, though, are a whole suite of different subduction zones. And subduction zones bring change because that brings plates together. Oceanic plates get subducted and destroyed, and whatever's tied to the overriding plate and the other plate come together, and eventually they'll collide. And so there's a very active tectonic boundary on the western side of Pangaea, and that subduction zone, like I said, is still there today on the west coast of South America and along much of Central America and North America. Well, the main event of the Permian is the Alleghanian orogeny of central Pangaea. Really, it's the main tectonic event that formed the supercontinent Pangaea itself. This has been going on since the end of the Mississippian, and it'll continue through the Pennsylvanian and to the end of the Permian. And it's a continent-continent collision between Gondwana and Euramerica, and so this would continue for millions of years. So we're finally at this last stage here, continent-continent collision, and just because the continents have come together doesn't mean they stop colliding. There's continued compression between them, so the mountains will keep rising as long as that's going on. That's true for India and Eurasia today with the Himalaya. They're still rising, even though they're still both in contact. They're still rising because there's still plate movement that's causing it. So this Alleghanian orogeny forms this huge east-west mountain belt, probably the biggest tectonic mountains that Earth has ever seen. Ancestral Appalachians, if you will. And as a result of this orogeny, we also had the ancestral Rockies, but by now they are waning in terms of their tectonic activity. The third and final orogeny of building the Appalachian Mountains. As I mentioned, the west coast of Laurasia would be very active with that subduction zone boundary, and so the Sonoman orogeny occurred at the middle portion of the Permian, and it would last into the Triassic. So sometimes we call this a Permo-Triassic event, Permian and Triassic. So it spanned the Paleozoic, Mesozoic boundary. It went from about 270 to 245. And it would involve collision of an island arc and a microcontinent. A microcontinent here is a name, it's called Sonomia, and some fragments of island arcs and this more major microcontinent called Sonomia would collide. It's almost like combining the Taconic and Akkadian orogenies in one. So the Sonoman orogeny would happen on the west coast. A lot of subduction-related thrust faulting because of the compression, folding. So very typical of a subduction-related orogeny. So very similar to the antler in that regard. So remember, the antler orogeny had the same kind of thing here with a subduction zone, west dipping subduction, and this ocean basin would close with continued subduction, and it brought that island arc in contact with Euramerica, and it got loaded up on the shoulder there. Well, behind that island arc was a oceanic plate, and now it is being subducted underneath this new arc and microcontinent, and that ocean basin is going to go away, and towards the middle of the Permian, all of this would come into contact with Laurasia in this case. So that would accrete even more area, which was not just island arc material, but also a small piece of microcontinent. So more terrain added onto the west coast. This has a certain name in Nevada. We see these rocks, we call it the Golconda terrain. And this was all added during the Sonoman orogeny. This west dipping subduction zone, again, just like with the antler orogeny, was the factor bringing this material into contact with Laurasia. Then the oceanic plate on the west side of Sonomia would actually, we think, flip to east dipping over time. Okay, so this is how continents grow. We've seen it on the east coast with the Taconic, Akkadian, and Alleghanian orogenies, and now with the antler and Sonoman orogenies on the west coast. Well, a lot of different rocks to talk about in the Permian, but perhaps the most significant would be in eastern Laurasia, the Siberian traps. And these erupted right at the end of the Permian, right at the boundary, as a matter of fact, at 252.3 down to 249. So these have been the focus of intense geochronology studies because we want to know the timing of these Siberian traps in relation to the end of Permian mass extinction. So that's why there's this precise number here on the first eruptions of the Siberian flood basalts. Massive eruption of basaltic volcanics over a few million years. 4 million cubic kilometers, that's probably a minimum, and maybe even more. 4 million cubic kilometers over a few million years, that's relatively short geologic time span. Here's the area in Siberia. So this is in Siberia today. And these in red are buried outcrops. And in green is where we see exposed basalts and other volcanic units. They're intrusions in the subsurface, so a massive area of volcanic and plutonic activity. This is what it actually looks like. Huge expanses of mafic volcanics. This is the geochronology of the Siberian traps showing the age dates, and they all are clustered right around 250, 252, 251, 250, 249 or so. Some have better constraints than others. A huge flood basalt event right at the boundary. We think it was fairly sulfur rich. One reason for that is below the Siberian trap horizon, there are anhydrite beds, evaporites. And so we think the magma came up and interacted with some of those calcium sulfates, incorporated some of the sulfur into the magma, and then released it as volcanic gas. So that sulfur dioxide gas in the eruption would have been added to the atmosphere, and that would have played havoc with the atmospheric composition. SO2 is a aerosol, gets up into the stratosphere, can block sunlight, cool the planet. There's also massive amounts of carbon dioxide with any volcanic eruption, so that would have had a warming effect. So a real impact this would have had. We think that it was pyroclastic, maybe as much as 20% of it from the deposits that we've mapped out. This is rather high for a flood basalt event. It's not just a passive outpouring, like a Kilauea eruption. We think actually there could have been some venting that produced eruption columns way up into through the weather layer, the troposphere, into the stratosphere. And that's important. If this flood basalt event produced gases and even ash that got into the stratosphere, it could have had much more significant global impact than if it was just limited to the troposphere, where weather would have more or less scrubbed it out. Let's move on over to the western side of Laurasia and talk about the Capitan limestone. And this is Middle Permian or so in age. This is a collection of carbonate rocks and evaporites that were deposited in a shallow marine or reef kind of environment. So this is what we think the Capitan Reef looked like in extent relative to today's boundaries, extending from the New Mexico-Texas border and forming a ring like this back down into Texas. And so a giant barrier reef complex. Notice this is the Carlsbad area of the Guadalupe Mountains, where Carlsbad Caverns are. And so here's an aerial picture looking down the front of the Guadalupe Mountains. Guadalupe Peak is actually the highest point in Texas, and it is formed by the Capitan limestone, so a real resistant carbonate rock. El Capitan is this distinctive butte right here on the end. All these rocks are carbonate rocks, which were originally formed in a shallow marine environment. Here are two geologic cross sections through the area showing what we think the depositional environment looked like back in the Permian. So as you go from the northwest to the southeast, you're going from shallow marine shelf into deeper and deeper water, possibly some reefs, and then into the deeper basins. And sometimes the basins were much deeper, sometimes the reefs were much bigger. So there's forereef and back reef environments, areas where the water was more shallow, much higher evaporation being near the equator, a lot more evaporite being formed. So carbonates full of fossils, full of shallow marine life, evaporites, both of which make up the rocks of this area, and the Capitan limestone is one of the significant ones. It's a carbonate rock situated right here, and that is what would become of Carlsbad Caverns much later in geologic time. These limestones here dipping down to the southeast like that in their reef kind of posture, later those would dissolve by groundwater and form the caverns we know as Carlsbad. So it's pretty cool to think that an ancient reef complex could become a huge cavern complex. Two totally different types of features. Here is El Capitan, okay, with the Guadalupe Mountains in the background there. So this actually used to be a shallow marine environment, a reef, and we're looking off to the north at it. And in those rocks there, a little bit farther up the range into New Mexico, are a whole bunch of different solution caverns, including Carlsbad. And here's a picture from down inside Carlsbad Caverns. There's all sorts of different speleothems down there. All this rock here is Permian carbonate rock, and then it has been dissolved and reprecipitated to form the cavern and the speleothems that we see today in Carlsbad. Staying in western Laurasia, let's move into Arizona and talk about the Grand Canyon. If you look at the Grand Canyon, the uppermost part from the top of the reddish layers to the rim, those are all Permian aged rocks. Most of the upper cliffs made up of Permian rocks. This is one of Ron Blakey's strat columns. It shows the Grand Canyon sequence that you would see along the South Kaibab Trail. We would see Pennsylvanian rocks of the Supai group, and then the very top of the Supai group, the last formation, the Esplanade Sandstone, is a Permian unit. Overlying that, that's the Hermit Formation. Above that, the Coconino Sandstone, the Toroweep Formation, and then finally the Kaibab Formation. This sequence here at the upper part of the Grand Canyon represents a bunch of different depositional environments, all Permian. Let's look at these Grand Canyon layers a little more closely. The oldest of the Permian layers is in the Supai group. Remember, the Supai group is a collection of 4 rock formations, 3 oldest of which are Pennsylvanian in age. And they start early Pennsylvanian about 323 and end up in the Permian at about 290. And the Permian unit is the Esplanade Sandstone. It's a cliff-forming sandstone seen here at O'Neill Butte. Below that are the cliffs and slopes of the lower parts of the Supai group. Okay, quartz arenite is what we think it is. It's a quartz sandstone, mostly quartz grains, and arenite means sand size, so it's dominantly quartz in composition and sandstone. We think that represents deposition in a coastal sand desert, probably on either a beach environment or floodplains that are represented by some of the other red beds in the sequence. The Pennsylvania Permian boundary is right through here, and that's the boundary between the Esplanade Sandstone here and the Wesco-Gami Formation below it. So it's pretty hard to see, even if you know what you're looking for. We have a class here getting ready to descend on the South Kaibab Trail even further. The trail will drop down and wind its way across the east side of O'Neill Butte on its way down to Skeleton Point and below. There are a few places with tetrapod tracks along the trail, even a boulder farther down off the trail. This is a similar set of tracks from Marble Canyon, from the Esplanade Sandstone, probably a reptile, given the fact that it has claw marks. And what else would be out in the middle of a bunch of sand dunes? Probably not an amphibian, so likely reptile. The next unit above the Esplanade is the Hermit Formation, and this is entirely Permian in age from 292 to 284. It's mostly a mudstone with some siltstones and such, and we think it represents a river floodplain environment. So after this pulse of sand deposition, in terms of the Esplanade, comes more river floodplain deposition. Here's the South Kaibab Trail descending through the Hermit, slopes of Hermit, because it's fairly weak, non-resistant mudstone, so it weathers into slopes. In some of these rocks we find plant fossils. There's ripple marks, mud cracks, a whole suite of sedimentary structures. This is O'Neill Butte in the distance. That's the Esplanade, and the Hermit is the layer that would have been right above it. The Hermit Formation on the strat column is right here. So this is kind of the top of the red bed sequence. So if you look at the north rim across the way, you can see this thick sequence of reddish layers. Most of it is the Supai group, and the very top of it would be the Hermit Formation. Above the Hermit Formation is the Coconino Sandstone, a very distinctive early Permian rock unit, roughly 284 to 272 in age. Here is the Coconino, massive cliffs of nice pure quartz sandstone. So huge crossbeds in the Coconino. Here's the Bright Angel Trail. There's Scotty there at the switchback. These are huge crossbeds in one dune sequence right there. That's the top of the dune, and then these are the crossbeds. So that is one giant dune. So we think these were large coastal sand dunes, much like in the Esplanade, but a thicker sequence of them. Several hundred feet of accumulation in this area. Within the Coconino itself aren't too many fossils, but we find trace fossils of various critters like this. And again, this is a tetrapod with claws, so this is probably some kind of reptile. Some of them have tail drag between the different footprints. And so again, a coastal dune sea, much like the Sahara, these are probably reptiles that are wandering from oasis to oasis. The Coconino is right here. It's a very distinctive layer, light-colored layer above the red rocks. In the canyon sequence, the Coconino is very distinctive. From a distance, you can see it. It's that lighter colored layer above the red rocks. The Toroweep and Kaibab formations cap off the Grand Canyon sequence, and they are early to middle Permian units from 284 to 269 in age, and they are exposed at the very top of the north and south rim. So the very distinctive cliff of Coconino commonly is overlain by a slope sequence of Toroweep formation, and then the Kaibab formation itself. The Toroweep's made up of 3 different members that are a little bit distinctive: a very thin member at the bottom, a thicker carbonate layer which tends to form a cliff, and then another slope forming mudstone and evaporite rich layer above it. Commonly it forms a slope sequence in between the cliffs of Coconino and the cliffs of Kaibab. Notice that the Kaibab cliffs are a little different than the Coconino. You can see the horizontal layering in there. These aren't cross-bedded sandstones, they're more well-bedded limestones and dolomites. Carbonate rocks, mudstones, evaporites, all deposited in a shallow marine setting right off the coast where Arizona used to be in the Permian. So the Kaibab and Toroweep formations are the very top units in the Grand Canyon. A couple other locations of note that have Permian rocks. One is in Sedona. What we see here is called the Schnebly Hill Formation, and this is early Permian in age as well. These are mostly fluvial and aeolian sandstones, stream and wind related sandstones. So that's what's making up these cliffs and slick rock areas. So slick rock, typically a sandstone that weathers a certain way. This is the Schnebly Hill Formation, which was discovered by Ron Blakey back in the 80s. And his research showed that this was a distinct formation. A lot of people wanted to call it Hermit Formation or Coconino, but actually the Coconino overlies it and the Hermit Formation underlies it. So it's a unit that is present in the Sedona area that pinches out farther north and is not present in the Grand Canyon. If it was, it would be in between the Hermit and the Coconino. So this is a rock formation that is indigenous really just for the central Arizona Sedona area. In fact, you can take a road from Sedona up under the Mogollon Rim. It's called the Schnebly Hill Road, and you'll pass through these exposures, and it's just amazing. Lastly, rocks of the Four Corners area, the Deshay Sandstone in and around Monument Valley is early Permian in age, and it's correlative with the Coconino Sandstone. It makes distinctive buttes and mesas, cliff-forming Dechet sandstone here, forming one of the mittens in Monument Valley. Here, another small mesa or butte in Monument Valley with little older Permian rocks below it and some younger Triassic rocks above it. So Permian Dechet sandstone, much the same as the Coconino sandstone. A little farther south in Canyon Dechet forms massive cliffs. Here's Ben and Jen to scale. This is Canyon del Muerto, a little stream, and then a huge cliff of Dechet sandstone with the desert varnish on it. This is Spider Rock, again all Dechet sandstone here. And the ruins themselves in Canyon Dechet are etched into a cliff of Dechet sandstone. The climate in the Permian begins as an ice age. It's relatively cold, continuation from the Pennsylvanian. These are the Gondwana glaciations or ice ages. These will end later in the Permian. So there's a gradual warming through the latter half of the Permian. We think the oxygen was very high. In fact, its highest levels ever on the planet during the Permian. Carbon dioxide was very low for the most part during the entire period until the very end when things would change very rapidly. So if you look at the Permian right here, very low, and then there's a distinct change right at the end at the Permian Triassic boundary. Oxygen would drop, carbon dioxide would come up. The climate itself across Pangaea would be one of extremes. With the warming trend, you would have large areas of Pangaea that would be arid or semi-arid, so more desert environments. The end climate would factor in a massive end of Permian mass extinction. Chaotic in terms of the climate at the end, and we're going to see a massive change in the life forms as well. Well, let's talk about Permian life, specifically the vertebrates that are on land, the reptiles. And these have become the dominant land vertebrate, more abundant now than the amphibians. If we look at the phylogenetic tree of reptiles, they got their start in the Pennsylvanian with very primitive forms like Hylonomus, and then the Permian was a time of diversification into various forms. Forms that we would recognize as dinosaurs, forms that we'd recognize eventually as snakes and turtles and lizards, and other forms that had a peculiar evolution from more reptile-like to actually into mammals. And so those are a very important offshoot. So we recognize these different types of reptiles. One way to classify them is their number of openings in their skull. This is the eye socket here, and so some reptiles with one opening we classify as synapsids. Turtles would be an example there. Ones with two openings, these are called mammal-like reptiles. That's a term that's very common. These are synapsids. This is the branch right here, which eventually would lead to pelycosaurs, the sailbacks, and then reptiles that have claws and fur, and then eventually mammals. And then the true reptiles here, the diapsids with three openings in their skull, those are very abundant types of reptiles as well. Reptiles are becoming the dominant land animal, certainly the land vertebrate. A little bit more about diapsids and synapsids. There's a diagram showing both. So diapsids are the true reptiles here in green, getting their start in the Pennsylvanian and then diversifying in the Permian, and as we'll see in the Mesozoic, branching off into different forms. So during the Permian is when we see various forms that will become eventually squamates, which are lizards and snakes. The other side of the branch are the archosaurs, which include what will become the dinosaurs and eventually turtles, crocodiles, and birds. Whereas the synapsids, remember these had two holes in their skull versus the diapsids three, these will give rise to not only the sailback reptiles, but also therapsids, and then eventually us, mammals. Well, this is important, the synapsids, because of what they would evolve into. Some refer to these reptiles as proto-mammals, and others say mammal-like reptiles. Well, if we look at the phylogeny here, synapsids are tetrapods. They have 4 limbs. And of the tetrapods, we had amphibians, and then we had the amniotes. And the amniotes would then produce different forms, including the synapsids. Again, 2 skull openings. So these are certain reptiles, amniotes, that have a certain cranial configuration. And those would evolve into pelycosaurs, which are the sailbacks. And those would evolve into something we call the therapsids, which are even more mammal-like in characteristics, eventually to mammals themselves. So when we talk about mammal evolution and human evolution, going far back, yes, we can go all the way back to Pikaia and lobe-finned fish and that kind of thing. Synapsids are part of that progression. In the Permian is where we see these mammal-like reptiles, synapsids, diversify into sailbacks, pelycosaurs, which eventually would go extinct in the Permian. But then the therapsids would evolve and become successful and evolve into what are called the cynodonts, and eventually in the Mesozoic into class Mammalia. One type of synapsid were the pelycosaurs, and these were relatively early in the Permian, and they are also known as sailbacks or axebacks. Very distinctive. We've seen these all over the place in popular culture with these sailback appendages on their backs. Almost looks like a dinosaur head strapped to a crocodile's body with a weird appendage on the back. These are not dinosaurs. They came before dinosaurs, and they're not even related to that kind of reptile. They're all different kinds. This shows the scale. From the movies, we always think they're giant. From like the movie Journey to the Center of the Earth, the original one, they had a crude Dimetrodon in that one, made to be very scary. They're typically human sized. They might be a little larger. Dimetrodon was one of the larger ones. Edaphosaurus was another one that was fairly large, but not huge brachiosaur proportion. They are more human-sized or even smaller. We think the sail was for different reasons. Sometimes life just does changes just for the heck of it. This could have been to regulate body temperature. You pump more blood into the sail and there's more surface area, you can cool off faster. You can also trap solar radiation if you orient it right and warm yourself up. And so there's different ways that the pelycosaur could regulate its body temperature. But whether it was Edaphosaurus or Dimetrodon, they're very similar, and we see fossils of these from rocks in West Texas. The therapsids were another important mammal-like reptile group, or synapsid, and these were reptiles that actually had hair. They were more upright in their posture. They were probably off the ground a little bit more, and they were possibly warm-blooded. And so they existed at a similar period as the pelycosaurs, but would actually evolve into more successful forms. So therapsids included a bunch of different kinds. The dicynodonts, we think, look like this, very typical in dioramas of the Permian, very successful herbivore. So this is like a mammal-like reptile version of a cow, eating plants in the Permian there. Gorgonopsids were very scary therapsids, and these were more predatory. So there's different versions of those that were probably carnivores. And then cynodonts were the later evolution of therapsids, and this Cynognathus is the closest therapsid mammal ancestor that we know of. Okay, to finish our discussion of life, let's talk about land plants. And one particular seed fern was Glossopteris. You'll see these fossils everywhere, very distinctive shape. This is a Permian seed fern like this, smaller leaves. This is the tongue-shaped leaves distinctive of this particular seed fern. So in the Permian, again, we did have spore plants, still have the segmented sphenopsids, we still have spore ferns, we still have lycopod trees, but growing in abundance are seed ferns and conifers. Well, here we are at the end of the Permian, and this is the largest mass extinction of them all. A major mass extinction at the end of the Permian, called the Permo-Triassic mass extinction. And this one, no matter how you estimate its size, was more significant than any of the other ones. Whether you measure it in genera or whether you measure it in smaller groups like species, 90% of all species on the planet went extinct. 90%, 9 out of every 10. So again, we've seen this diagram before, going from the beginning of the Phanerozoic until the end, showing the big 5 mass extinctions with the yellow triangles. Here's the one at the end of the Ordovician. Here's the end Devonian. The third one is, not that one, that one there at the end of the Permian. And notice the relative drop-off from here down to here. And so this one had the biggest percentage drop. There's another one at the end of the Triassic, another one at the end of the Cretaceous, but this is the big one. No matter how it's measured, this was a significant change in the development of life on the planet. Well, it's our job to figure out why these mass extinctions occur. Why would 90% of the life on the planet go extinct over a relatively short period of time? In terms of the end Permian mass extinction, the main factor was probably the eruption of these Siberian flood basalts, the Siberian traps. Eruption of several million cubic kilometers of lava, pyroclastic material, and all the associated gas would have changed not just the regional environment for sure, but the global atmosphere and climate. Eruption of this amount of material, if it was vigorous enough, we think that it possibly was, given the 20% of the eruptive products were pyroclastic. We think that the gases emitted from these flood basalts wouldn't have just been low-level tropospheric kind of gases where rain would have scrubbed them out. We think they actually could have made it into the stratosphere, where they would have been transported around the world and had global effect. The SO2, sulfur dioxide haze, would have tended to cool the planet, whereas the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would have had the opposite effect. So it would have been kind of a double whammy. It would have been a little bit chaotic. Sea levels would have fluctuated for sure in shallow continental areas. A massive disruption to the climate, which really did affect the ecosystems on the planet. There could have been other factors as well, possible asteroid impact, and other factors involving methane hydrates and some other things. But what we do know of is this eruption of the Siberian traps right at the end of the Permian probably had the most to do with this mass extinction. Just like Occam's razor relates to us, the simplest explanation probably is the most correct one.